What is the format of the evening?
Sir, I think they will briefly introduce both of you, and then I will get the conversation going, and then you read from your poetry, and then we'll take questions from the audience.
Okay.
Hi all, am I audible? So
Yes,
sorry to
yes.
interrupt you. It's lovely to have such, small talks as we start this session. That's why I didn't say anything. I know interrupt you guys. So yeah, I'll welcome you all to another wonderful session of Ensemble, a series of webinars organized by EFL Students Union. We have with us three eminent personalities, Sir Vijay Kumar, Tadakamalla, Sri Satchidanandan sir, and Sri Daruwalla sir. This is a poetry session, so guys, sit back and enjoy. No restrictions, keep away the gadgets and pay attention. Poetry is a lifesaver in times like this. We need poetry right now. And as Sugita Kumari, the famed poetess of Kerala, says, it is always a pleasure to sing for a kindred spirit. And sir, dear poets, we ensure you that they're all kindred spirits, so you can take us into confidence and share your poetry with us. And we look forward to your talks. First of all, I'm Gopika Hari. I'm doing my English Literature MA in EFL Hyderabad. I have published an anthology titled Golden Feathers, and I'm a regular contributor to the literary journal, The Literary Vibes. Also a part of the Poetry Chain community in Toronto. And you can find me in Miracle app under the pen name Gopika Mira. Now, of course, it's not me you are looking forward to. So here is a CV of our dear personalities who are with us today. So, Sir Keki N Daruwalla, he writes poetry and fiction and lives in Delhi. He also writes political columns in newspapers. His first poetry volume, Under Orion, was published 50 years ago in 1970. He has 12 volumes of poetry, the last of which was Naishpur and Babylon in 2018. His main interest is fiction these days, and his three novels, For Pepper and Christ, Ancestral Affairs, and Swerving to Solitude, came out recently. He's also midway through a novella on the old Alexandrian Library. He has joined the Indian Police Service in 1958 and retired as chairman JIC in 1995. He has been awarded Sahithya Academy in 1984, the Commonwealth Poetry Prize for his book Landscapes, and the Poet Laureate Literature Live in 2017, and Padma Shri in 2014. Now, about Professor K. Satchidanandan, he's a Malayalam poet, playwright, travelist, travel writer, essayist, and bilingual critic and translator. He has been the former secretary of Sahithya Academy. He has won so far 52 regional, national, and international awards for his literary contribution, including Kerala Sahithya Academy Awards in 5 genres, Sahithya Academy Award, Eruthajan Award, the highest award for a writer in Kerala, besides Tata Literature Live Poet Laureate Award, Poetry for Peace International Award from UAE, Knighthood from the Government of Italy, and Indo-Poland Friendship Medal from the Government of Poland. He was in the Ladbrokes list of 10 probable Nobel Prize winners in 2011. And about Sir Vijay Kumar, he was an English professor at Osmania University, Hyderabad, and he is one of the directors of Hyderabad Literary Festival. So now that you have an idea of every poet, I'll get into the procedure that we'll follow in the discussion. There's no strict procedure as such. So Vijay Kumar will be acting as he'll be initiating dialogues between the poets. The poets will read to us their poems, and then there will be a conversation about the same. And all of you participants, feel free to ask questions in the chat box. I'll take up the questions and we'll discuss them with the poets towards the end of the session. Now, I'll just say 2 lines from each of the poets just to introduce that style of writing. Satchidanandan sir has written this poem Cactus, in which in this last stanza, he says, I create another beauty beyond the moonlight, this side of dreams, a sharp, piercing, parallel language. Satchidanandan sir, I really hope and invite you to create such a parallel language with us today also. And Keki Daruwalla sir, I'm really impressed by a lot of poems of yours, and I quote the last two lines of the poem, Before the World. What was it like before language dropped like dew, covering the scuffed grass of our lives? So we are really interested to know what language was like that then. A warm welcome to all of you once again. Enough with my gambling on. Here, handing over the mic to Sir Vijay Kumar Tadakamalla. Once again, welcoming all to the Ensemble session.
Thank you, Gopika. And let me first thank the students of EFLU for giving me this honor to be in conversation with two very well-known poets. I've had the pleasure of knowing both of them. I think probably this is the third time that I'm sharing a platform. Of course, here it's a virtual platform with Keki sir. I think the first time was long ago when he launched his book, A House in Ranikhet, in Hyderabad, in the British Library. And the second time was when he came to Hyderabad to launch Sridhara Swami's book of poems. Yes. So I'm delighted to be in conversation with Keki Sahib once again. And Sachida has been with us in HLF twice, in 2010 and 2013. And unfortunately, after that, we could not get him because very often he has been busy with his own Lit Fest in Kerala when the Hyderabad Literary Festival takes place. But of course, this event via the virtual space makes possible for people from different parts to be in the same frame, as it were. And so I'm delighted once again to be with both Professor Satchidanandan and Shri Keki Daruwalla. Sachida, I would like to begin with you. Am I clear audibly? Am I audible, sir?
Yeah, perfectly audible. Yeah.
Right, sir. So I'll begin with you. Sachida, you write poetry in Malayalam and you write criticism as well as criticism in both Malayalam and English. You translate from and English into English, and you also taught English. Have you ever tried writing in English? I mean, creative writing?
Yeah, that was when I was a student in the college. I used to write in both the languages, my mother tongue Malayalam as well as English. But later, I went on writing in Malayalam. At the same time, at some point of time, I also began translating a lot of my own poetry as well as the poetry by quite a lot of fellow poets in Malayalam into English. The purpose was to introduce Malayalam poetry to non-Malayali readers. And in the beginning, some other people translated my poetry. I was not very happy with many of those translations. And I thought I would try my hand at it. And I thought it was not very bad, probably because I found that national and international journals accepting these translations. So that gave me kind of confidence to go forward. So I began to translate whatever I thought could come into English. Because there's a good chunk of my poetry which has not appeared in English, which I don't dare touch. Because they are so local and so full of regional, references and suggestions and things that only the Keralites might understand. Otherwise, I will have to destroy the poem with a lot of footnotes, which is something I absolutely hate. So I confine myself to translating whatever I think can come in. Some things which have what can be called universal elements. All poetry certainly has some kind of universal element. So I keep translating such poems into English. And that became a kind of practice because journals began to ask for my poems, so I would translate, and then so there are quite a few collections of my poetry in English translation, and of course in many other languages.
But you don't write directly in English anymore.
No, I don't. Somehow no. It is. I love poets like Keki, poets like Arun Kodadkar, Adil Jasawala, Nisime Sekil. All of them I love a lot. I respect poets, including A.K. Ramanujan, and quite a few others, even younger poets who write in English. Yeah. But I find that I am incapable of writing in English because the music of English, the cadences, the finer suggestions and the nuances of the language, and the introduction of my culture in that language, the infusion of English with my culture, I find these very challenging, in fact. And that's why I thought I would better write in Malayalam, and whatever can be translated into English, okay, they can appear in English.
And you have not attempted fiction so far, have you?
Yeah, I have. Strangely, Professor Vijay, in the last 2 years, I have been writing short stories. And my first collection of short stories is just about, it is in press, and in 2 weeks or 3, it should come out. It just came like that. And I never thought I would ever write fiction. But I came into it just like Keki did, perhaps. Keki also, began to write stories, and then he wrote 2 wonderful novels. So I have about 15 stories now, which are getting collected, as I said. Yes, that happened later.
And since in the introduction, Gopika mentioned language, and since we are on the topic of language, I would like to ask Keki sir. You have been exposed to different languages, particularly during your childhood. Moving from Lahore to Junagadh to Rampur to then Punjab, and of course during your service, I'm sure you have served in different parts of India with different linguistic backgrounds. So, have you ever attempted anything other than in English?
No, nothing apart from English, because I didn't want to jump into a language I'm not really familiar or good at. So I stuck to English and never deviated.
And any of those influences of your multilingual background, I mean, do they kind of come into your writing in English?
The background always matters, especially when you're writing fiction.
Okay.
The background and your knowledge of other languages and the way people speak, that has a greater impact on your fiction than on poetry.
And also, I wanted to ask you: do you have any memories of partition, and have you written about it?
I have written 2 stories about the partition, but I came away from Lalpur. It was known as Lalpur then, in 1945, when my father retired at the age of 55. Professor retired at the age of 55 those days. And now they go on and on, if you don't mind my saying so. But my brothers got stuck there. What my brothers told me about Lahore, they came through Rajputana later on, and we were stuck to the radio, to the Murphy radio, listening for news, because both my eldest brothers were in Punjab during partition. So my memories are what they told me about us. For example, the Nihang Sikhs took out a 2-mile procession in Lalpur saying, अखंड रहेगा हिंदुस्तान, नहीं बनेगा पाकिस्तान, and they brandish their swords. Now the memory remains with me as if I have actually seen the procession.
Interestingly, I found it quite interesting coincidence that both you and Sachida have published your first books. You of course published your first collection of poems, and Sachida published his book of criticism, both in 1970. And
Yes.
you, both of you published your second book in 1971.
Yes.
And you, of course, continue with your poetry, and Sachida published his second book, which was a collection of poetry. And Sachida, I want to ask you, you are one of the pioneering poets of modern Malayalam poetry. So, in the specific context of India or even Malayalam, what does modernity mean? I mean, what do we mean when we say modern poetry? How is it different from the poetry that was existing at that time?
Yeah, in fact, as I am now growing old, and I have begun to lose faith in terms like modern and postmodern, actually speaking. But yes, in the 1960s, there was a kind of break. At least it was perceived as a kind of break at that point of time. Even though when I look back, I can also see a lot of continuity with the poetry of the past. And the break was mainly in form. For example, free verse was introduced. Prose was used as a major medium of poetry, which was almost unknown in Malayalam. And then there were new kinds of images, not necessarily broken, but perfect images actually. There were very, very fresh images, fresh metaphors, new ways of looking at life, especially looking at the conflicts of contemporary life. You know, one of the earliest poems which was supposed to have pioneered modern Malayalam poetry is titled Kurukshetram, written by Dr. Ayyappa Panikkar, who is no more.
Yeah.
And as the very title indicates, it is a token of the deeper conflicts within the modern mind. He conceives the modern mind as a kind of Kurukshetra, a battle between the old world and the unborn new world, a battle between the old idea of justice and kindness and the new world where justice and kindness are getting orphaned. So various kinds of conflicts. So that was a general mood. There was a mood of disillusionment also, in the post-Gandhian period in India. When politics seemed to be gradually losing its ethical values. And so there was a kind of deviation that had set in public life. All these impacted poets profoundly, and we were trying to find a language that would express this kind of disillusionment, the new conflicts, the dilemmas of contemporary life with its different dimensions.
And how did that get expressed in language? Was there a different idiom that you employed?
Indeed, that's what exactly I meant, because we were using very fresh kinds of metaphors and images, which were seldom used in the poetry of the past. Right. There is an image, for example, of dead bodies waiting to wake up, lying in the cradle. This is an image from Ayyappa Panikkar again. It's the same poem. Okay. So this kind of imagery was absolutely new, and so we were all. Of course, many people thought we were very obscure, very difficult, even though now nobody thinks so. But at that point of time, especially the conservative critics were very, very critical of our poetry. They wouldn't accept us as poets So they would say, oh, they're writing, just very unpoetic kinds of things. They're dealing with unpoetic themes. Because there was a set concept of poetry which we were trying to break. And we were also trying to transcend the kind of cliches which had come into Malayalam poetry, like into any poetry. It happens to any poetry, because we had a very strong romantic tradition, if I can use that term. I use it with great suspicion now. But there was this Kalpanika Prasthanam, the romantic movement. And that had created a very sweet language in which we could never express the kind of bitterness that we were feeling in our mind. So we had to invent a new idiom, new images and metaphors, and often also break the meter and either create new meters, sometimes revive some forgotten meters, sometimes write in free verse, and sometimes in prose in various tones.
Yeah. So apart from the form, there was also corresponding change in the language that you were using, the way in which you express those thoughts. You mentioned your suspicion of these terms now, and how terms like romanticism become very suspicious now. But I was struck by your research. Your research was on post-structuralist poetics, and I was wondering how much of your academic work, because you have been an academic also, how much of that academic exposure to different literary movements internationally, how much has it kind of influenced your own writing when you started writing?
I do not think theory has influenced me deeply as a poet. Of course, as an academic, as somebody dealing especially with the comparative literature, theory has been of great help. All kinds of theory, right from Eliot and Richards to Foucault and Derrida and the later ones, including Agamben and Ranchie, and all of them have impacted me, my thought and my critical thinking. But I do not think that they have impacted my poetry very deeply. But while I do admit I have been influenced very much by a lot of poetry being written in other Indian languages and also in many European languages. And at one point of time, especially in the 70s, the African and Latin American poetry was a major influence on some of us. We were quite young at that time, and myself, Keki Shankar, quite a few of my contemporaries were deeply impacted by the radical elements in African poetry, Afro-American poetry, and also in Latin American poetry. I was the first to translate Pablo Neruda, for example, a whole collection of Pablo Neruda into Malayalam, and quite a few other. I have a whole anthology of Latin American poetry, another anthology of African poetry. Yeah, and later European poetry also had a but I wouldn't say direct influence, but some kind of oblique influence definitely they have.
Because I was wondering, how does one dissociate or separate the critical thinking mind and the creative writing mind? So, I mean, even as a poet, when you are kind of writing something, doesn't your training in the critical thinking, doesn't it seep into your creative writing?
No, not in the form of theory. That is exactly what I said. Not as theory, but yes, it has definitely helped sharpen my critical mind. And when I look at my own poetry after I write it, when I look at the first draft and the second draft, certainly all these things come in. You look at your own poetic language with a profoundly critical eye. You try to be objective to your own poetry. You try to revise it as many times as possible. And that kind of critical faculty has certainly been assisted a lot by my reading in theory and literary criticism.
Yes. Keki sir, since Sachida mentioned this modernism, modern poetry, etc., you perhaps stepped into writing poetry when people like Nissim Ezekiel and A.K. Ramanujan had already kind of set up what came to be known as modern poetry in English in India. So, how much of that were you aware of, or how much of that really influenced your writing when you started writing poetry?
No one, I'm sorry, not many people influenced me when I was writing poetry. I wrote poetry
As it came.
as I saw it. I come from a literature family. My father taught English. We had about 3,000 or 4,000 books at home. And we read drama, we read poetry. And if anything influenced me, it was English literature. My answers are short.
So you were never part of the Bombay group of poets?
No, never. The first time I went was in 1966 when I met Nissim Ezekiel, and I had already known Kersi Katrak. And Kersi Katrak even had a poetry reading by me. And the intros were very short. When I was asked to read, he said to the audience, Keki N Daruwalla, and I started. No intros. Why must we find ourselves in a season of prophecies with no prophets around? Shall I read? I'll read 2 or 3 if you don't mind.
Go ahead,
there is the miracle. And I deliberately went against too many bleak poems. Okay, this miracle. The miracle of the dawn prayer, gold in its hair, and of the vespers lamp black after dusk, and the monotone of the night cricket, solitary, articulate, and the miracle of the snow lion, belt line, water roar. Glacier green as a carbuncle, river gleaming white, mirroring the clouds. No clouded leopard here, says the herdsman. What troubles us is the black panther, blacker than the night. The seasons, sensual as flesh, as they go the rounds. This promontory, crowded with vultures, this estuary marked with gulls. The sea there, as always, and the harbor swarming with schooner and the sailboat, rudders, masts and hulls. Brittle coral, firm as rock, thick smell of frying fish. The lighthouse, so wrapped in history, it forgot to turn on its light. But constellations switch on their mysteries as the Magi fish for omens. Sing hymns, celebratory, forget sickness, blight, the wonder of the calendar that makes us forget. The ears are seamless. Come on, turn the page. This miracle, the world dragged by time's oxen into another furrow, another seedbed, another age. That was also written during the millennium. May I?
Please, go ahead.
If that's all, that's
Go ahead, sir. Go ahead.
This is, I find a lot of our language poets write to God. This is the first time I have written a poem to God. And this is reporting to Jehovah, heaven's intelligence officer, seconded to the IB, reports to God activities of the about to fall archangel. I have just been reading Dante. In fact, I spoke on Dante 2 days back to a university. So here is the devil himself talking. Do good and evil have a border? Archangel asked. This is the reporter going ahead. Do good and evil have a border? Archangel asked. Black diamonds in eye sockets. Was himself in the chair. Meeting, call to order. All rebel angels cozy in his pocket. A nitpicking South Indian was also there, scratching his dhoti that flapped over his privates. Satan preempted him by speaking first. This virus brings good news for other primates. We need to congratulate ourselves and raise a drink to friends. Rhinos are thriving. Indians call them genda. Hyenas are doing well. Strength lies in numbers. Indian broke in, sir. How about agenda? Simple, said Lucifer. We are not fussy. We just want an end to democracy. Second poem. This is a longer sonnet because the reporter, he doesn't know too much of literature. So this is an elongated sonnet. What about secularism? The Indian asked, cleaning the ochre amber from his lips. Those particular being secular have fled. Transition smooth, streaming without blips. The officer asked to record these trifles, couldn't contain himself, paunch spilling over belt, swore fealty to God and Grey Mantri, who held the rifle, started prayers with IB crawling all over his pit. Oh Dios, Jehovah, Osiris, Ra, I am lost for words. Wish I had a dagger to its handle toward my hand, as Cervantes da said in his poem on Macbeth. I simply stagger at Lucifer's arrogance. Can you believe it? Someone asked, are we allowed to fiddle with the machines? We'll just stack the votes. Liberals won't know whether to crap or fiddle. Lucifer said, let them write first the priorities. Let's first fix the minorities. I'm through.
Would you also like to share any interesting stories about your poems? Any stories that are associated with any of your poems? Because
really
Sachida said that every poem has a story to it. So
yes, it does have, but I'm afraid I'm not. I don't have it in my memory at the moment to come up with a story on a poem. No, I remember a poem I've written somewhere recently. The first line got in. Winter got into my bed. Winter got into my bed, and the poem started. I remember a poem in Oxford. Christmas is very, very lonely because everyone is busy with his family and you are alone. And I had 2 lines from a paper. The double-deckers hustled down from Kidlington and Cuttlerslow. And I took those 2 lines from the paper and the whole poem started the same rhythm. Because the first line or the first stanza is very important because the poem follows cadence, follows the rhythm which you come out with in the very first stanza.
Yeah. Sachida, may I request you to read your poems?
Maybe I will.
Yeah.
I'll first read a poem called Women. Of course, these are my own translations of my poems. I have always felt, and I have no doubt about that women are stronger than men. Even though woman, has this Sanskrit synonym, abara, or somebody who is weak. But all the women in my life, my mother, my sister, my wife, have been stronger than me. And I have been the weakling in the family and maybe in the society too. So this is about women and women's power. Women. One woman walks in a hurry, sobbing, a house with faded paint on her head. One woman goes on waiting at a railway station where no train stops. One woman with a halo of glowworms walks in the dark towards the stars. One woman makes sure her wings are in place before she launches herself into a flight. One woman steps to a cornfield in drought with a rain cloud on her shoulder. One woman sings a song, making a fruit tree in autumn burst into blossom. One woman glints a spark of fire in the ashes of her little house set on fire. One woman scoops up her baby and flees to the border, watching a fighter jet swoop down. One woman sharpens the letters of the alphabet and pulls out the fangs of the enveloping ark. One woman closes the door of her house with a bang, walks out and hums a medley on the street. One woman looks at the image of Jesus on the cross and yells in agony, "Son, my darling son." One woman leaves her man on the panel in Khajuraho and finds her pleasure herself. One woman, her muscles hardening as I look on, turns into a goddess of iron and fire. One woman sharpens her sickle again and again, rubbing it against a rock in a forest stream. One woman climbs up a tank and offers colors to soldiers with the moon's smile. One woman, tired of her life on earth, leaves for space in a vehicle made of her own bones. One man stands aghast on the roadside, too scared to cross the road.
Yeah. Yes. I would also like you to read something in Malayalam also.
I'll do that. Just before that,
Yes.
I'll read a poem that is topical. I do write topical poems. I Delhi, like Keki generally. And in Delhi, we witnessed a lot of migrant workers walking several kilometers, unable to even to catch a train to reach their home when the virus struck. So I wrote, in fact, 2 or 3 poems around that theme in different ways, and I'll read just one of them called The Train. That train is going to the village, but I am not in it. Its rails are inside me. Its wheels are on my chest, and its whistle is my scream. I won't be there when it comes back to take me, but my life will travel seated on its roof, guarding my corpse. As the train stops at my village, my breath will enter my body and ride my waiting bicycle along the old familiar lanes. My children will come running as they hear its bell. Ammu is here, Ammu is here. In which language can I tell them? It is my dead body that has arrived, of heaven or of hell. I am somewhere in between. Let the well talk or the pond. If water refuses to speak, let my life dwell with an echo on the drumstick tree on my courtyard and tell them the truth. I read a short poem, a very short poem in English, and then read a few lines in Malay. It's called The Keys. Well, it has something to do with my own life, my autobiography. Even though it ends in another kind of it has another kind of end. It's called The Keys. When Gandhi was shot dead, I was just 2. Father must have wept. I don't remember. When Nehru died, I was 18. Father came home with the newspaper and I saw him sit down, almost fall, his hands on his brow, leaning forward, pale. When Father went on his pilgrimage, he had left his bunch of keys at home. He never returned. Only the news came on the 3rd day. Even today, I keep on trying those keys to open the secrets of the universe. My poems.
Wow. Lovely.
I don't read a whole poem, but I'll read maybe a short excerpt from a poem in Malayalam. And then I hope we'll have some time for questions. I'll read the same poems which you have heard just now.
Yeah.
It's called Takol, the word for key in Malayalam. Gandhi വധിക്കപ്പെട്ടപ്പോൾ എനിക്ക് അച്ഛൻ കരഞ്ഞിരിക്കണം, എനിക്ക് ഓർമ്മയില്ല. നെഹ്റു മരിക്കുമ്പോൾ എനിക്ക് 18. അച്ഛൻ പത്രവുമായി വന്ന് കസേരയിൽ മുന്നോട്ടാഞ്ഞ് മേശയിൽ ശിരസ് താങ്ങി ഇരിക്കുന്നത് ഞാൻ കണ്ടു. അച്ഛൻ തീർത്ഥയാത്രയ്ക്ക് പോയപ്പോൾ താക്കോൽ കൂട്ടം വീട്ടിൽ വെച്ചാണ് പോയത്. അദ്ദേഹം തിരിച്ചു വന്നില്ല. 3-ാം ദിവസം ആ വാർത്ത മാത്രം വന്നു. ഇന്നും പ്രപഞ്ചത്തിന്റെ രഹസ്യം തുറക്കാൻ ഞാൻ ആ താക്കോലുകൾ മാറി മാറി പരീക്ഷിക്കുന്നു. അവയാണ് എൻ്റെ കവിതകൾ.
Wonderful. And also, please, tell us any interesting story associated with any of your poems.
Well, there are quite a few. I'll just tell you one incident that happened with one of my poems. I have a whole series of poems on the house, on the various houses in which I live, the various rented houses, my own old Tarawad or the ancestral home. I had finally built my own home in the place where I used to teach in a college. And I had to sell that resource of that house in order to buy a flat in Delhi when I moved to Delhi. And the man who bought the house, he was in the Gulf, like many Malayalis, he was in Dubai. And he just raised the house to the ground with a bulldozer, because he wanted to build a big bungalow there, which he never did somehow. But he wanted it, and he destroyed the house. But that was a house which was so dear to me, because I had, built it with great difficulty, taking loans, and I was personally involved in making that house. It was so dear to me, and it was a house where so many people had come. Dear friends, revolutionaries, ordinary people, great hermits and thinkers, critics and poets, young poets and old poets. So I had so many memories of friendships. So I wrote a poem on that house, and the poem was called my last poem about the house. That was my last poem about the house, actually. And this poem I have read when I went to Dubai. I was invited for a poet's meet there. I read it. I had never seen the man who had actually purchased the house. He had appointed somebody else to do the signing and all that, or had given the power of attorney to somebody. So when I read this poem, after the poet's was over, one man stood up from the crowd, the listening crowd, and he came to me in great pain and told me, "Sir, it was I who had purchased that house. and I had raised it to the ground. And I never knew that that house was so dear to you. I feel really sorry. And you were almost on the verge of tears. And my wife was also with me at that time. And the next day he invited me to his home for breakfast and all that. It was like meeting a character from your own story, I did not know who had purchased it, but this was the man, and he was filled with pain because I was speaking of all the memories that filled the house and all the profound and deep emotional association I had with that house, and he was deeply moved. That is one of the many stories about about the many poems on the house and on other things.
At least he was sensitive enough to respond to those emotions.
Yeah, he did. That was why he came to attend a poetry meet at all. He was now in a really.
I know. Yeah. Let me see. I think one last question from my side, and then we will take questions from the audience. Because Satchidanandan, you've been associated with Sahithya Academy for a long time. Both with the Academy as well as the journal Indian Literature, and then also with NTM, the National Translation Mission. So if we see their functioning, do you think that these organizations, particularly Sahithya Academy or Indian Literature, do you think that they are doing enough to promote, showcase Indian literature?
Well, that's a question to which I myself have tried to find an answer and have not yet found a proper answer. With the limited budget that we get, that Sahithya Academy gets, a budget that is constantly reduced these days, it is hard to cope with the kind of challenges that a national happening in the different languages of India. Because so much is happening. There are so many new writers, very talented writers, both poets and fiction writers and playwrights. But they are far behind the time very often. Because by the time these organizations come to hear about some important work in a language, it has already, many years have already elapsed.
Right.
And then we have to find a proper translator, which is another problem. And so I think there is a gap between what is actually happening on the ground in the languages and what is happening in these national institutions which are meant to promote the language. And that gap is not easy to bridge. That's my feeling. So I am not perfectly satisfied, even though all of us try to do whatever we could to the best of our ability. But in spite of that, I think more institutions will have to be built to catch what's actually happening.
Keki Sahab, this is a slightly similar question that I want to ask you. Yes. That you have been writing about and reviewing poetry anthologies of younger poets and sometimes not necessarily younger poets in the newspapers, etc. So, do you think that there is a need for this kind of fostering a community of poets and probably some kind of a mentoring that is possible? I mean, do you think that's senior poets like you or Sachida or others can play a kind of a mentoring role with younger poets?
I'm not happy with the word mentoring.
Okay.
I don't want to be a mentor, and I haven't had any real mentors apart from Nissim Ezekiel, who would tell you where you have gone wrong. I wrote the Poetry Wire for I think 4 or 5 years in the Hindu, where I was a bit trenchant with poetry. You get a book and you praise it, and you also now and then point out a flaw. And this was sometimes liked and sometimes not really appreciated. Bombay, for example, have had mentors. They've had Nissim, they had Dom.
Yes.
They had Adil Jasawala with the Chora right at the NCPA. So they've had mentors, but now there are none. Now there are collectives. They all gather together. The English poets, about 25 or 30 of them, and they read out their poems, and they are a very fine fraternity. Delhi has nothing of the kind. Delhi has nothing of the kind, and also not the poetry of the standard of the Bombay poets. I wouldn't know much about Chennai and Hyderabad. Hyderabad should have some very good poets. I'm not happy with this mentoring. I mean, the American thing with, where you go in for a creative writing course, that is different. That is, we don't have a single one in India. I do think we should be having a few. The universities must start thinking on those lines.
Yeah.
Not just in English, but in all the other languages.
Yes, true.
And I must say, because I was the convener for the English language in the Sahithya Academy, it becomes a very tough, it becomes almost impossible for one institution to manage 22 languages, and Satchidanandan talked about 50. So that itself is very difficult, and the magazine can't manage it. The last thing I wish to say is all the Indian language writers wanted to be translated into English, not into Hindi. They just wanted to be translated into English. Bad poetry to the Englishman looking at it, or to the one who is familiar with English poetry, and they wanted it to be translated into English variant.
I'll take questions now from the audience. The first question is to you, Keki sir. In the era of YouTube and Instagram, can poetry qualify as pop culture? and is there a need for senior poets to also migrate to social media?
I am not sure. Why not? We can participate in the social media. I now and then do so on the Facebook, but I'm too old for Instagram. I don't even know what it actually means. Today, on my Facebook, they said you must have a hashtag, and I don't know how to manage a hashtag on my Facebook. So there it is. But for the younger poets, people in their 50s and 40s, they can do a lot. But the poets could get into pop culture now and then, but pop culture can't get into poetry easily.
Well said. Well said. I think the similar question to Satchidanandan, Professor Satchidanandan, how can we navigate through censorship in the digital age?
Navigate to center space.
Digital age. How can we navigate through censorship in the digital age?
I'm not very sure that digital age has radicalized poetry as many people seem to think. Yes, it has made poetry more popular, it is true. And also, many young poets can publish their own poetry. They can have their own blog, for example. And I was the first to edit a collection of blog poetry in Malayalam in the form of a book. And I know the kind of proportion of good poetry to bad poetry written in blogs. I read 6,000 poems and I could choose 60 poems. This is a very honest statement of my own experience. So the problem is, well, you can get published easily, but earlier we had editors who were good readers, who knew what good poetry meant, and so it passed through some kind of a filter. And now that filtering process is very often wrong there, since poets publish themselves. And when they publish something on the blog or maybe on the Facebook, they get a lot of likes, and they get exaggerated praise. Many people say, "Oh, this is the greatest poem I have read after Shakespeare," or whatever. And especially mediocre poets fall for that kind of praise. If they are really good and solid poets, they will not. They will know, "Oh, this man is lying. My poem is that good," and they will definitely improve their poetry. But many poets, unfortunately, fall for that type of false praise, and so they never develop. So that is one of the weaknesses of the social media. The strength is that, okay, now you can publish without the need of going to an editor or going to a mainstream publisher or even a niche publisher. But publishing alone, as you know, does not make poetry. So it needs editing. It needs not mentoring, but at least a self-mentoring. It needs the poet should look at the poem, and it is also good that many other people read these poems and give some kind of feedback, which might be of some help. Even though, as Keki said, in our generation we had no mentors. Actually, we wrote whatever came to us. We got some opinions from some senior poets and all that, but we never asked them to mentor us and or to teach us poetry. We didn't have a choice, actually. So we wrote whatever came to us. Sometimes we were appreciative, sometimes we were critique, and we took both with it in equanimity.
Right. I think this is a question to both of you. Are there any poems that you did not complete and you still regret for not completing? Are there any incomplete poems or poems that you started but could not complete and you still remember those poems? And it's like asking an actor, is there a role that you ever wanted to play and regret not playing?
My answer would be, I have so many unfinished poems, and especially in my earlier days, I have no regrets for them. I mean, an unfinished poem or an unfinished novel. I have 2 unfinished novels, and I'm very, very happy that I never wrote them. I mean, I can't imagine how bad they were. So, firstly, the poem could be bad, and that's why you left it. Or the inspiration, if that's the word, went away, disappeared into fog, and you never progressed with the poem. That's bad luck. I recently wanted to write a poem on stillness, and I started, and I know what happened. I talked about ocean where things were not still. And before I could come to the still ocean, the poem vanished, and there it is. I threw it away.
Yeah. Satchidanandan?
Yeah, my answer would not be very different, actually, because I have also many poems which could never complete, and I know why I could not complete it, and that's why I'm not very sorry about it. As Keki very well said, sometimes what you call inspiration, I don't want to mystify poetry, but there is something that that strikes a chord in you, which produces a poem, that somehow trailed off and you could not complete it, or you found that you were not happy with the lines you have already written, and there was no point in going forward. So whatever poems I have given up are poems I should have given up, and so I am not very sorry about it.
Yeah.
I had a huge project of writing a series of poems based on Mahabharata with a new kind of viewpoint, which I could never. I wrote 2 poems actually, but I could not go on. First of all, I found I was growing old and I may never be able to complete that. Secondly, by the time I found Karthika Nair had come out with a wonderful collection of poems based on Mahabharata characters. You must have read
Yes,
Lions. And after that, because I found many of the perspectives which I had in mind were already reflected or made use of in many of her poems. Then I thought what I write would, even if they would not be imitations of those poems, they would look like imitations. Then I gave up the whole idea. This has happened earlier also. Sometimes you find a poem which you wanted to write, but which has been written by somebody else, and sometimes even better than you could have written. And then why do you worry about that? And that is the only project I have given up, actually.
But is it also possible, another question asks, is it also possible that sometimes you leave a poem midway and come back to it and complete it? Sometimes, would you be able to convey the meaning that you intended when there is a huge gap, or if not huge, at least a gap between the beginning and picking up later?
You still can. I remember one of my better poems is The Glass Blower. And the first portion I wrote when I was in England. And a year later, I said the number 2 has to go. It has to come, sorry. And I wrote the second part of the poem. And there it was. But they were complete different sections. One section and the second section. So once in a while you can do that, but otherwise, once it's gone from your mind, gone from your heart, better leave it where it is.
Sachida?
Yeah.